Hello and welcome to this video on social policy, comparisons, functionalism, Donzelot and the neoliberal New Right perspective. Firstly, social policy refers to legislation and ideas that governments put in place. In recent years, the government in the United Kingdom has been becoming more and more concerned about families. Government policies reflect society's values. However, they are often caught between trying to promote traditional family values and also respecting the increasing family diversity within society today. Firstly, let's go through some comparative pieces of different family policies from around the globe. In China, there is the one-child policy, or there was up until very recently. This was an attempt to limit population growth and discourage couples from having more than one child. The government supervised by workplace family planning, and women had to seek permission in order to get pregnant. There was a waiting list, and there was also a quota system. Couples who complied with this system received benefits, whereas those who did not were heavily fined for having extra children. Ultimately, this led to claims of what was known as gendercide, because culturally the norm was that people wanted to have a little boy first, and that the idea was that that boy would grow up, get a good job, and be able to pay for his parents when he or they got a little bit older, when they were retired and they were elderly and infirm. And so because people wanted little boys, because the belief was that they earned more, often when couples were having their early scan to find out how the baby was doing, if they discovered it was a girl, they were having an abortion. And so this was referred to or labelled as gendercide. As of 2016, however, we've seen changes to the one-child policy, and it is now a two-child policy. And the hope is that will mean that many couples will be able to have a boy and a girl, because currently there's a big imbalance in terms of the sex ratio in China today. Looking to the past ever so slightly, we can look at what happened in communist Romania. The former communist government of Romania in the 1980s introduced policies to increase the birth rate, which had been declining for some time. For example, contraception and abortion were heavily restricted, and divorce was made more difficult. In fact, unmarried adults and childless couples had to pay extra income tax, so there was a financial incentive to get married and have children, and that was what the communist government at that time wanted. Looking even further into the past, we can look at Nazi family policy from the 1930s and 40s. Nazi Germany in the 1930s pursued a twofold policy. On one hand, they sought to encourage the healthy and racially pure to breed a master race. And this fits with Adolf Hitler and his personal ideology that there should be the creation of a Aryan master race who were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, athletic, muscular type individuals, very intelligent. And he believed that the German peoples were the ideal fit for this Aryan master race. And so he wanted to encourage these sorts of people to breed and have more children. So abortion and contraception were restricted. Also, women were kept out of the workforce in the belief that if they were kept at home, they were likely to have more children, again, growing the numbers of this Aryan race. At the same time, 375,000 people were sterilised, that is, their ability to have children was taken away from them on the grounds of physical malformation or disability, mental retardation, epilepsy, imbecility or madness, deafness or blindness. In fact, many of these people, once they had been sterilised, would then end up in concentration camps and would die. If we compare this to contemporary times and to democratic societies across the world, such as the UK, we find that in contrast with these extreme examples, in democratic societies, the family is seen as a private sphere of life. That is to say, governments generally do not interfere unless there has been some sort of breakdown within the family. Many sociologists would argue, however, that governments in these societies still play an important role in shaping family life. So, let's begin to look at some perspectives on families and social policies, and we'll begin with the functionalist perspective. Functionalists argue that society is built on consensus or agreement, and the state acts for the benefit of all, and policies are therefore there to help families. They have a fairly positive view of the state and its involvement in family policy. Fletcher in 1966 looked to examples such as health policy, education policy, and housing policies, and how these help to the family to perform its key roles. However, there are some criticisms of this view. Functionalists assume all family members benefit from these policies, whereas some arguably benefit men more than women, and this would be the concern of feminists. There's also an assumption here that there's a march of progress, that generally speaking policies are good, that they're getting better, and they're helping families, and they're improving the lives of families. In reality, this may not be the case, and Marxists, for example, would say policies are often reversed, and the clock is turned back, and we can look at, say, how the welfare state was introduced to try and support families, and slowly over time we've seen cuts to that welfare state, and now there is less money and less resources available for families, and so arguably the clock has been rolled back in that sense. A key sociologist by the name of Jacques Donzelot in 1977 put forward this concept that perhaps families were being policed by the state in a fairly negative fashion. So, Donzelot's conflict approach argues that social policy is being used as a form of state power over families. He uses Michel Foucault's concept of surveillance, that is, observing and monitoring people, and he sees state power as being used over the family in a range of different ways. So what Donzelot is doing here is using Foucault's ideas to explain that perhaps the family is under surveillance, it's being watched by the state, and this is actually a form of control. So social workers, health visitors and doctors use their knowledge to control and change families. Particularly, we find that this is targeted towards poorer families who are often identified as a problem by the state. So there does seem to be a social class dynamic here, and there is an element perhaps of kind of Marxist theory creeping in also. Condry noted how the state may seek to control and regulate parenting through imposing parenting orders via courts. So in some situations, if parents are considered to not be doing their role correctly, or in the eyes of the state in the way that they would see as positive, you may find that the state intervenes and puts parenting orders on parents and does things such as inform parents that they need to now go to parenting classes. Donzelot shows the power of knowledge here and of experts such as doctors and social workers within society and how they can exert control over families. However, there are some criticisms here. Marxists, interestingly, and feminists would argue that he fails to articulate who precisely benefits from these policies, and one would imagine that Marxists would say it would be the bourgeoisie or the ruling class, whilst feminists would say it would be men as a result of patriarchy. Our next perspective that we need to consider is very important, and this is the work of neoliberals and the New Right, who in particular had a big influence and input on social policy towards families from the late 70s, early 80s onwards, and even to this day we find there are echoes of their ideas in contemporary government policy on families. Neoliberals and the New Right are strongly in favour of the conventional or traditional nuclear family, that is a married heterosexual couple with a division of labour and children. They are concerned that recent family diversity is threatening the conventional nuclear family, creating social issues or problems, and leading to dependency upon the welfare state. There are a number of key sociologists within this perspective whom we need to be aware of. Some we've met before, some we haven't met at all. But firstly, Brenda Armand argues that laws making divorce easier have undermined marriage, that the introduction of marriage equality means that heterosexual marriage is no longer seen as superior to other setups, and that homosexual marriage is now considered acceptable, and for her, that's not something which is desirable. Moreover, tax laws, she would say, discriminate against conventional families and therefore need to be changed. Neoliberals and the New Right point out that increased rights for unmarried cohabitants, for example adoption and pension rights, cause cohabitation and marriage to seem similar, and they would argue that this is unacceptable. One key name we come across before is the work of Charles Murray, and he believes that the rising lone parenthood is the result of an over-generous welfare state, that our welfare state provides perverse incentives for in particular young women to go out to get pregnant and to have a child in the belief that they're going to be rewarded by the state, and that actually it prevents fathers from taking responsibility and playing an important role in the upbringing of their children, because these fathers may be thinking, well, the state can do it for me, so why do I need to do it? As a result, this has created a dependency culture where people feel that they don't need to look after themselves, that the state will do it for them. He therefore advocates the abolition of welfare for single parents, argues it threatens the family's two key functions, and that is socialisation of the young and maintenance of a work ethic amongst men. So take away the welfare state, or at the very least reduce it, make it much harder to access, and perhaps we'd see less social problems, are the views of not only neoliberals and the New Right, but in particular Charles Murray. Neoliberals and the New Right offer a number of different solutions to the social problems they identify in society in relation to the family. Firstly, they believe there should be a general cut in welfare spending, and that there should be restrictions on eligibility for state handouts or benefits. And so the hope is by doing that, you're going to be reducing that dependency culture. They believe there should be a reduction in taxes generally speaking, but also in particular income tax, and that this would incentivize people to work, and in particular fathers to work, because they'd be taking more of their own money at home and they'd be able to provide for their families that way, and they're not having to pay taxes in order to hand out benefits. So it's kind of a win-win scenario for neoliberals and the New Right in that respect. They believe that we should be denying council housing to unmarried teenage mothers. They believe it's acting as a perverse incentive. That there should be tax breaks for married couples, and empowering of the child maintenance service. So this is the organisation who chase fathers who may be absentee to ensure that they are paying their way with regards to the raising of their children, and that therefore mums aren't completely reliant, if they are in a single scenario, on the state. They also believe that there should be generally less state interference. However, thinking about the previous bullet point or the previous statement, that does seem somewhat confusing and a little bit hypocritical. In terms of criticisms of this perspective, well, feminists would argue that this is an attempt to re-establish the traditional patriarchal nuclear family and to subordinate women. It's an attempt to turn back the clock, which they think is undesirable, and that it's not really possible now to put the genie back in the bottle, as it were. There's also an assumption here that neoliberals and the New Right make, and it's very similar to the assumption that Functionalists make, which is that the nuclear family is somehow natural. Now, we know, having looked at families throughout history, that families change in shape and size, and they take on different roles over time, and so the idea that there is one particular family type that applies for everyone all over the world is probably nonsense. And to be honest, what really is natural is a very confusing and subjective viewpoint. Finally, Abbott and Wallace argue that cutting benefits simply drives the poor into greater poverty. It's not a way really of incentivizing them to work harder. If anything, it may have a demoralizing effect. That's it. Thank you very much.